The cage elevator screamed against its rusted guide rails, a metallic shriek that echoed down the black throat of the Nexus 9 mining station. Level 80, level 85, deeper into the crushing dark. Harlan leaned his weight against the cold steel mesh of the car. He was 58 years old and his spine felt every single ton of the millions of tons of rock pressing down from the surface above. He wore a heavy canvas rig stained black with years of machine grease and carbon scoring. A battered welding mask hung from his neck. He looked down at his right hand. It was trembling. It always trembled when the air pressure dropped. It was a phantom echo, a physiological ghost. 10 years ago, he had been standing at a primary pressure valve on a deep space rig. The warning light had flashed crimson. He was supposed to hit the manual override to seal the bulkhead, but he froze. Just for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of looking at the light, his brain failing to tell his hand to move. By the time his fingers slammed the button, the valve had blown. The explosive decompression had ripped through the lower deck. It took out the entire maintenance crew. It took his younger brother. Now his hand shook, a permanent cruel reminder wired directly into his nervous system. The station med droids called it severe nerve trauma. Harlan called it the price of living. The elevator hit level 99 with a bone-jarring thud. The gates slid open, spitting a cloud of stagnant, iron-tasting dust into the corridor. Warden Vane was waiting. Vane wore a pristine gray uniform that had never seen a hard day of work. His boots were polished. His hands were clean. Harlan hated men with clean hands in a place like this. "You took your time," Welder Vane said, his voice clipped and hollow in the cavernous tunnel. "The lift runs on its own time, Warden." Harlan kept his eyes forward, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He shifted the 60-pound portable welding rig on his shoulder. It bit into his collarbone, but he didn't adjust it. "What is the job?" "We have a containment issue in the primary biovault," Vane said, turning on his heel and walking briskly down the dimly lit corridor. "The specimen is fighting the siphon grid." She cracked the primary collar. "I need it fused solid. No flex, no breathing room." Harlan just nodded. He didn't ask questions. "You don't ask questions on Nexus 9 if you want to keep your bunk and your rations." They reached the end of the tunnel. Heavy set of blast doors thick enough to survive a tactical strike stood closed. Vane punched a code into the keypad. The hydraulic locks disengaged with a sound like a dying beast. The doors parted. A wave of heat washed over Harlan, smelling of raw ozone, burnt copper, and something else. Something ancient, like a thunderstorm trapped in a jar. He stepped into the vault. The chamber was massive, a hollowed-out cavern of black rock crisscrossed with thick industrial cables. At the center of the room, illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving glare of sodium vapor floodlights, was the source of the station's power. Harlan stopped walking. His breath caught in his throat. They had told him it was a beast, a mindless biological anomaly dredged up from the outer rim. They lied. She was suspended between 4 reinforced titanium pillars. Thick cables of crackling blue energy wrapped around her wrists, her waist, and her neck, pulling her taut. She was humanoid, but scaled to an impossible godlike proportion. 25 feet of raw, undeniable majesty brought low by corporate greed. Her skin was the color of a deep bruised twilight, a rich, dark violet that seemed to absorb the harsh lighting rather than reflect it. Faint, intricate patterns traced along her arms and sides, glowing with a faint, pulse-like rhythm. She was battered, covered in soot and minor abrasions from fighting the chains. Then she opened her eyes. Harlan felt a cold shock run down his spine. Her eyes were pure glowing white. No pupils, no irises, just pools of ancient, exhausted starlight. And they were looking right at him. There was no animal rage in those eyes. There was only a profound, crushing intelligence layered with a heavy, suffocating loneliness. She was suffering. The energy chains were not just holding her, they were leaching from her, draining her bioelectricity to power the mining drills miles above their heads. "Get to work," Vane snapped, pointing up at the heavy steel collar locked around her throat. "I want that seam welded tight. If she moves, I want it to choke her." Harlan did not look at Vane. He set his heavy rig down on the metal grating. The clang echoed through the silent vault. He pulled his heavy leather gloves over his scarred hands. He pulled the welding mask up over his face, plunging the world into darkness, save for the narrow, rectangular viewport. He engaged the magnetic clamps on his boots and began the slow walk up the curved maintenance gantry that brought him level with her chest. As he got closer, the sheer scale of her became overwhelming. He was a small, fragile thing of flesh and bone. One strike from her giant hand could crush him into dust. He could hear her breathing. It was a deep, rhythmic rumble, like the sound of tectonic plates shifting deep underground. He reached the platform near her shoulder. The heat coming off her skin was intense, like standing next to an open blast furnace. She turned her head slightly, the massive, glowing white eyes fixed on him. He saw the muscles in her neck tighten. She braced herself. She expected the burn. She expected the pain. Everyone who came into this room brought her pain. Harlan ignited his torch. A vicious, blinding blue flame shot from the nozzle, hissing violently in the stagnant air. He stepped up to the collar. It was thick, crude steel digging deeply into her violet skin. Dark purple blood had crusted at the edges, where the metal chafed against her collarbone. The lock mechanism was strained, the metal groaning under her sheer physical power. Harlan raised the torch. His right hand was shaking terribly. The blue flame danced wildly, threatening to scorch her skin. He closed his eyes under the mask. He took a slow, deep breath, pulling the smell of ozone and her unique thunderstorm scent into his lungs. He forced the memory of the blown airlock down into the dark corners of his mind. He locked his wrist. The shaking subsided just enough. He opened his eyes and leaned in. He did not weld the seam tighter. Instead, he pressed the blue flame against the primary locking pin. He melted the slag, softening the metal. Then, with a heavy strike from his wrench, he forced the locking bracket outward. He shifted the collar half an inch wider. It was barely noticeable to the naked eye, but he saw the immediate release of pressure on her throat. He quickly applied a heavy layer of flux and welded the bracket into its new looser position. The sparks rained down, cascading over her dark skin like falling stars. He killed the torch. The blue flame vanished. Underneath the mask, Harlan looked at her. She was staring at him. The tension in her massive shoulders had dropped. The subtle shift in the collar allowed her to draw a full, deep breath without the metal biting into her flesh. She did not speak. She simply watched him, her glowing eyes tracking his every movement as he flipped his mask down and began his descent back to the floor. Done, Harlan grunted, packing his hoses back into his rig. Vane looked up, squinting at the dark metal of the collar. It holds. It holds. Harlan lied. His voice was flat, empty. Good. The shift siren blared a harsh, grating wail that signaled the end of the rotation. Leave your gear, welder. Maintenance shift is over. Vane turned and walked out. The heavy blast doors began to cycle open. Harlan stood by his tool crate. He watched the guards pack their stun batons and move toward the exit. The vault was emptying. He reached into the deep cargo pocket of his canvas pants. He pulled out his ration block. It was a dense gray square of compressed oats and protein paste. It tasted like sawdust and engine oil. It was his only meal for the next 12 hours. He looked at the Titan. She was slumped forward slightly against the energy chains, exhausted. The siphon was pulling the light from her skin. Harlan walked forward. He bypassed the yellow warning line painted on the floor. He walked right up to the edge of the containment grid. He reached out and set the wrapped ration block down on the steel grating right beneath the massive chained fingers of her right hand. He didn't look up to see if she noticed. He didn't offer a smile. He didn't want to thank you. He just turned around, his boots heavy on the metal floor, and walked out the blast doors before they sealed shut. The ride back to the barracks was silent. Harlan sat in his cramped metal-walled bunk. The station vibrated with the constant hum of machinery. The air was cold, recycled, and stale. He sat on the edge of his thin mattress and stared at his right hand. It was shaking worse than ever. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the cold, hollow ache of his nerves. The tremor moved up his forearm. He clenched his fist tightly, trying to force it to stop. It didn't work. It never worked. He looked at the clock on the bulkhead. 0200 hours. The entire sector was asleep. Harlan stood up. He walked over to his footlocker and kicked the latch open. He dug past his spare work clothes and pulled out a heavy-duty thermal coil. It was scrap something he had salvaged from a broken transport shuttle and wired to a portable battery pack. It was illegal to hoard tech, but the lower decks were freezing, and the company didn't care if the workers froze in their sleep. He slung the coil over his shoulder. He picked up his keycard. He walked out of his quarters. The quarters were empty, bathed in the dim red glow of the night cycle lights. He took the maintenance shafts, avoiding the main elevators and the security patrols. He knew the blind spots of Nexus 9 better than the architects who built it. He descended, back into the dark. When he reached level 99, he bypassed the blast door keypad. He pulled a small splicing tool from his belt, popped the access panel, and crossed the primary wires. The hydraulic locks clicked softly. The doors slid open just enough for him to slip through. The vault was pitch black, save for the crackling blue light of the energy chains and the soft rhythmic glow pulsing beneath the Titan's violet skin. She was awake. As soon as Harlan stepped through the doors, her massive white eyes found him in the darkness. She didn't move. The chains hummed loudly in the quiet room. The air in the vault was freezing. During the night cycle, the station diverted life support from the lower levels to save power. The ambient temperature was hovering near zero. Harlan walked past the warning line. He approached her left side. He unslung the thermal coil and set it on the grating. He hooked the cables to the battery pack and flipped the switch. The coil hissed, glowing a dull, angry orange. A wave of intense dry heat pushed upward, combating the bitter chill of the vault. He aimed the blower directly at her massive legs, where the cold steel of the floor was sapping her body heat. He sat down on his overturned tool crate, a few feet from her ankle. He crossed his arms over his chest, shivering slightly in his thin canvas jacket. For a long time there was only silence, just the hum of the heater and the crackle of the chains. Then a sound broke the quiet. It was a deep, resonant rumble, originating deep within her massive chest. It wasn't a growl, it was a sea, a release of tension. Harlan looked up. She was looking down at him. The glowing white eyes were soft. The harsh defensive glare was gone. She shifted her weight, the heavy metal chains clanking loudly. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her massive head. She brought her face as close to the ground as the chains would allow. She was only 10 feet away from him now. The sheer size of her features was staggering. A single strand of her dark hair was thicker than a heavy mooring rope. Harlan didn't flinch. He didn't pull back. He just sat there, his right hand resting on his knee, trembling violently. She looked at his hand, then she moved her leg. It was a slow, careful movement. She shifted her massive foot, bringing her ankle closer to where he sat on the crate. She stopped when her skin was less than an arm's length away from him. Harlan stared at the expanse of deep violet skin. The intricate, glowing patterns pulsed slowly like a heartbeat. He didn't think. He didn't rationalize the danger. He just moved. He reached out with his shaking right hand. The air grew warmer the closer his fingers got to her flesh. He placed his bare, scarred palm flat against the side of her ankle. The sensation was immediate. Her skin was not rough like stone. It was not cold like machinery. It was incredibly soft like heavy spun silk. And it was hot, a deep radiating warmth that seeped instantly through his calloused skin and into his aching joints. But it was more than just heat. A subtle rhythmic vibration pulsed beneath her skin, a low-frequency electrical hum. It flowed from her flesh through his fingertips and rushed up his arm. It bypassed his muscles and went straight to his nervous system. It felt like standing in the center of a quiet ancient forest. It felt like peace. Harlan looked down at his arm. His hand was completely still. For the first time in 10 years, the violent, punishing tremor was gone. His fingers rested calmly against her violet skin. The phantom pain of the blown airlock, the echoes of his failure, the crushing weight of his guilt, it all went silent, muted by the sheer overwhelming presence of the being sitting beside him. He exhaled a breath he felt like he had been holding for a decade. His shoulders dropped. The tight, coiled spring in his chest unwound. He looked up. The Titan was watching him. There was no fear in her eyes. There was only a quiet, ancient understanding. She had felt his brokenness. She had felt the shattered pieces of his mind. And she had offered him the only thing she had left to give: comfort. Harlan slowly pulled his hand back. As soon as his fingers left her skin, a faint, dull ache returned to his knuckles. But the violent shaking did not come back. His hand remained steady. He looked at her. He didn't have the words. He was a man who spoke in welds and heavy metal. He didn't know how to articulate what had just happened, so he simply nodded. A slow, respectful dip of his chin. The massive Titan blinked slowly. The glowing white eyes closed for a fraction of a second, acknowledging the gesture. Harlan settled back onto his crate. He leaned against the cold iron pillar beside him, pulling his canvas jacket tight against his chest. He closed his eyes, listening to the hum of the thermal coil and the deep, steady rhythm of her breathing. For the first time since he had arrived on the god-forsaken rock of Nexus 9, Harlan slept. And for the first time in 10 years, he did not dream of the void. The shifts blurred into a heavy, relentless cycle of iron dust and time. Nexus 9 did not care about the men who bled in its belly, and it certainly did not care about the giantess chained to its reactor core. But Harlan cared. He didn't announce his presence anymore. He didn't need to. Every third night cycle, when the station's ambient hum dropped to a low, vibrating growl, he slipped through the maintenance grates. He brought his tools. He brought silence. And he brought the only thing of value he possessed, his labor. The vault was always freezing. The corporate overseers routed all thermal energy to the upper executive decks, leaving the lower containment levels to rot in the bitter manufactured winter. Oressa suffered the worst of it. The energy chains siphoned her natural heat, leaving her violet skin pale, the glowing patterns along her arms dimming like dying embers. Harlan couldn't break the chains. Not yet. The grid was wired to explosive fail-safes. But a welder knows how to reroute pressure. A welder knows how to cheat a system. He spent 3 night cycles crawling through the narrow, jagged ventilation shafts above her cell. He cut his shoulders on rusted sheet metal. He breathed in decades of toxic lithium dust. He used a portable plasma cutter to sever a secondary exhaust line from the main smelting furnace, dragging heavily insulated flex piping down through the dark. On the 4th night, he kicked the vent grating loose. It clattered against the iron floor. Oressa looked up. Her massive, pupil-less white eyes tracked him in the gloom. The heavy chains clanked as she shifted her weight. She watched as he hauled the thick silver piping out of the wall and mounted it to a structural beam. He clamped it down his wrench, ringing out in the quiet vault. He reached over and pulled the heavy iron lever on the pipe. A deep, hollow rush of air filled the room. It wasn't just air. It was a torrential blast of pure, dry heat directly from the smelter's runoff. The wave of warmth hit the floor and rolled upward, wrapping around Oressa's shivering, towering form. She gasped. It was a sound like wind rushing through a canyon. Her massive shoulders dropped. She leaned into the column of hot air, closing her eyes. The pale, ash-like hue of her skin began to fade, replaced by the rich, deep violet that belonged there. The luminescent markings on her ribs flared to life, glowing with a soft, steady rhythm. Harlan didn't smile. He just wiped the black grease from his forehead with the back of his scarred hand. He sat down on his overturned tool crate, pulling a battered thermos from his rig. They didn't share a language. Harlan didn't know the tongue of Titans, and she had not spoken a word of his. So they spoke in the language of the mines. Harlan tapped his chest twice, then pointed to the vent. "I built this." Oressa opened her eyes. She lowered her massive head, the thick obsidian waterfall of her hair cascading over her shoulders. She raised her right hand, fighting the resistance of the blue energy tethers. She pressed her index finger to her chest, then slowly extended her palm flat toward him. It was a gesture of profound respect, an acknowledgement of a debt. Harlan chewed on the inside of his cheek. He set his thermos down. He stood up, wiping his hands on his canvas pants. He wanted to return the gesture. It felt necessary. It felt right. He pressed a finger to his chest. He tried to mimic the fluid sweeping motion of her massive arm. He took a step forward, extending his hand flat. He didn't see the puddle of slick, black, hydraulic fluid pooled near the base of the structural beam. His heavy steel-toed boot hit the oil. He lost his footing instantly. Both of his legs went out from under him. He hit the iron grating hard, his back slamming against the deck with a heavy thud. His wrench flew out of his belt, clattering loudly across the floor. He lay there for a second, staring up at the dark, cavernous ceiling. He waited for the pain to register in his spine. Then the floor began to vibrate. It started as a low rumble, a seismic tremor that shook the dust from the overhead pipes. Harlan sat up quickly, his hand dropping to the heavy plasma cutter at his hip. He thought the reactor was failing. He looked at Oressa. Her shoulders were shaking. Her head was thrown back. Her mouth was open. She was laughing. The sound was incredible. It was deep, rich, and utterly musical. It wasn't the roar of a beast. It was the pure, unadulterated joy of a sentient being. The laughter echoed off the titanium walls, drowning out the hum of the station, washing over Harlan like a physical wave. It was warm. It was alive. Harlan stared at her. The harsh lines of his weathered face softened. The permanent scowl carved into his jawline slowly broke. The corners of his mouth twitched. Before he could stop himself, a dry, raspy chuckle escaped his throat. Then another. Soon the old welder was sitting in a puddle of hydraulic fluid, holding his bruised ribs, laughing alongside a 25-foot alien queen in the bowels of a prison colony. In that moment, the chains didn't matter. The station didn't matter. The crushing weight of the galaxy vanished. There was no monster in this room. There was only Lyra, and there was only him. The laughter eventually faded into a comfortable, heavy silence. Harlan picked himself up, wiping the grime from his jacket. He walked over to a high-pressure coolant valve near the base of her containment grid. It was leaking a steady drip of corrosive fluid pooling near her foot. He pulled a heavy wrench from his belt and knelt down to tighten the fitting. He gripped the wrench. He squeezed the handle. His right hand betrayed him. The tremor started in his knuckles, a violent, uncontrollable spasm that shot up his forearm. The wrench clattered against the iron pipe. The sound metal striking metal was sharp. Too sharp. It sounded exactly like a blown airlock. Harlan froze. The vault faded. He was back on the rig. The flashing red lights, the screaming alarms. He saw his brother's face through the reinforced glass hands slamming against the door. He felt his own legs locked in place. He felt the 3 seconds of pure, cowardly hesitation. Then the vacuum. The silence. The wrench slipped from his trembling grip and hit the floor. Harlan collapsed back onto his heels. He gripped his right wrist with his left hand, squeezing hard enough to leave bruises, trying to force the shaking to stop. His breathing grew ragged. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold metal beneath him. A shadow fell over him. Oressa had shifted her weight. She knelt as low as the energy chains allowed. She didn't make a sound. She didn't offer empty words. She simply extended her right hand. The blue energy tethers sparked and bit into her flesh as she pushed against their limits, reaching out toward the small, broken man on the floor. Her massive index finger, thick as a tree trunk and warm as a hearth, gently came to rest against his shoulder. The bioelectric hum washed over him instantly. It was a grounding current. It flowed through his shoulder, down his spine, and into his right arm. It didn't burn. It anchored him. Harlan stopped fighting his own body. He let his head drop, his chin resting on his chest. 3 seconds, he whispered. The words were gravelly torn from a place deep inside him that hadn't seen the light in 10 years. 3 seconds of fear. I froze at the console. My brother was on the other side of the bulkhead. I hesitated, and the vacuum took him. He stared at his scarred, trembling hand. I fix everything down here. I can weld a shattered hull. I can rebuild a turbine. But I can't fix this. I can't fix what I did. Oressa's finger applied a fraction more pressure. A gentle, steadying weight. The glowing patterns on her skin pulsed in time with his racing heartbeat, slowly bringing his pulse down to match hers. The violent shaking in his hands subsided into a dull, manageable ache. She didn't pity him. He could feel it in the current she passed to him. She understood the weight of survival. She understood the ghosts that haunt the living. Harlan leaned his shoulder against her massive finger. He closed his eyes. For the rest of the night cycle, he didn't move. He slept sitting against the steel grating, anchored to reality by the gentle, impossible warmth of the giantess beside him. The illusion of peace shattered 2 days later. Harlan was hidden in the upper gantry shadows when the primary blast doors opened. Warden Vane strode in, flanked by 4 heavily armored corporate technicians. They rolled a massive, ominous piece of machinery into the vault. A biokinetic extractor. The upper levels are failing, Vane barked, pointing at Oressa. The new reactor is offline. The board wants production up by 50% by the end of the week. A technician looked at a datapad. Sir, the specimen is already at 70% drain. If we hook up the extractor and pull the core reserve, she won't survive the process. It will burn her nervous system to ash. Vane's face was stone. It's an animal, a battery with a heartbeat. Strip her down. Hook up the extractor. We initiate the deep drain at the start of the next shift. Harlan's blood ran cold. He gripped the iron railing of the gantry, his knuckles turning white. He looked down at Oressa. She heard them. She understood. She didn't thrash. She didn't roar. She simply raised her head, looking past the warden, her white eyes searching the shadows of the upper gantry. She found Harlan. The technicians left. The blast doors sealed. Harlan climbed down the ladder fast, his boots ringing on the rungs. He hit the floor and ran to the edge of the containment grid. Oressa was standing tall. The ambient lights in the vault flickered and died, leaving only the crackling blue of the chains. In the darkness, her violet skin began to glow with blinding intensity. The patterns on her flesh shifted, forming intricate ancient runes. Harlan stepped back. He had seen those runes before, scrawled in the margins of old spacer logs, carved into dead rocks on the edge of the galaxy. They weren't tribal markings. They were a lineage. She wasn't just a titan. She was a matriarch, the apex of her species, a life-bringer capable of absorbing and projecting the energy of a star. And Nexus 9 was about to bleed her to death to run a rock crusher. She looked down at him. She placed her hand over her chest, right over her heart, and gave him a slow final nod. It was a goodbye. Something inside Harlan snapped. A rusted locked door in his mind finally blew open. He had stood frozen at a console once. He had watched someone die because he lacked the iron to move. He had spent 10 years punishing himself for those 3 seconds. He was out of time. He was out of excuses. No, he growled. The sound was guttural, raw. He turned his back on her. He didn't run to the chains. He couldn't break them with a torch, but he knew what powered them. He grabbed his heavy welding rig, throwing the 60-pound tank onto his back. He sprinted toward the back of the vault, where the massive reinforced steel door of the primary substation sat locked behind a heavy biometric seal. He ignited his plasma torch. The blue flame roared to life, a foot long and blindingly hot. He didn't bother with the lock. He drove the flame directly into the center of the steel door. Sparks showered over him, burning holes in his canvas jacket, searing his skin. He didn't flinch. His hand didn't shake. It was perfectly, beautifully steady. He cut a ragged circle through the thick steel. He kicked the heavy plate inward. It crashed to the floor inside the substation. Harlan crawled through the jagged hole. The room was humming with immense lethal voltage. Towering capacitors fed power directly into Oressa's chains. The shift siren began to wail, a piercing, relentless scream. The deep drain was initiating. Outside the substation, Oressa threw her head back. A sound of pure agony tore from her throat as the chains flared blinding white, ripping the life force from her cells. "Hold on!" Harlan roared over the noise. He didn't look for a switch. He looked for the main coolant line feeding the thermal core of the capacitors. He raised his heavy iron wrench. He swung it with every ounce of strength in his 58-year-old shoulders. The wrench struck the valve. Metal shattered. High-pressure liquid nitrogen exploded into the room, a blinding white cloud of freezing vapor. The thermal core spiked immediately. The warning lights turned from yellow to a furious flashing crimson. Harlan dove back through the hole in the door, hitting the deck of the vault hard and covering his head. The substation detonated. It wasn't a fireball. It was an electrical implosion. A massive shockwave of displaced air and raw voltage ripped through the vault. The overhead lights exploded in a shower of glass. The control panels shorted out in bursts of black smoke. And the blue energy chains holding the matriarch flickered, sparked, and died. Total darkness consumed the vault. Silence hung for a single breathless second. Then the floor heaved. A deafening sound of rending metal echoed in the blackness. The titanium pillars, each thick as a redwood tree, groaned and shrieked. Through the smoke, Harlan saw her. Oressa wasn't weak. She had been holding back. Freed from the siphon, the true terrifying power of a matriarch flooded back into her veins. She gripped the massive steel collar around her neck. Her muscles bunched. With a violent jerk, she tore the lock apart. The heavy iron crashed to the floor. The blast doors at the end of the hall began to grind open. Red emergency lights bathed the vault in a bloody glow. Warden Vane stood in the doorway, flanked by a dozen heavily armed guards. They raised their pulse rifles. Fire Vane screamed. Red laser fire cut through the smoke, scorching the air. Harlan scrambled to his feet, reaching for his plasma cutter. He was too slow. A guard tracked him, the laser sight painting his chest red. Suddenly, the world went dark. A massive violet hand swept out of the smoke, dwarfing Harlan completely. Oressa scooped him off the floor with staggering speed and shocking gentleness. She pulled him tight against her chest, wrapping her thick fingers around him to form an impenetrable cage of flesh and bone. The heat of her body was a furnace. Harlan could hear the massive, thunderous beating of her heart against his ear. The laser fire hit her. It struck her back, her shoulders, her legs. It didn't pierce her. Her skin absorbed the kinetic energy, the impact points flaring with bright, angry light before dissipating. She didn't run toward the blast doors. She turned toward the solid rock wall of the Nexus 9 outer hull. "Hold on, Welder," a voice resonated. It didn't come from her mouth. It vibrated directly into his bones, a telepathic echo of pure, focused intent. Oressa lowered her shoulder. She charged. 25 feet of raw, unstoppable momentum slammed into the cavern wall. The rocks shattered. Steel support beams buckled like wet paper. The entire sector shook violently as she drove herself through 30 feet of solid stone and reinforced hull plating. They burst out into the night. The cold vacuum of the crimson waste hit them instantly. Nexus 9 was built into the side of a massive crater. Below them stretched an endless sea of rust-red sand, illuminated by the ghostly light of twin moons. Oressa hit the ground running. Her massive strides ate up the distance, kicking up clouds of red dust that hung in the low gravity. Behind them, the mining station bled black smoke into the atmosphere. Sirens wailed into the empty night. They were free. But freedom is rarely cheap. The scream of engines tore through the sky. 3 corporate gunships crested the ridge of the crater, their searchlights cutting through the dust, hunting for the massive thermal signature of a fleeing Titan. Target acquired a mechanized voice boom from the lead ship's external speakers. "Lethal force authorized. Heavy artillery open fire. Not lasers, armor-piercing kinetic rounds." The ground around them erupted in geysers of red sand and shattered rock. Oressa dodged, her agility terrifying for a creature of her size, but the gunships had the high ground. A heavy round struck the earth directly in front of her. The explosion threw a wave of razor-sharp shrapnel into the air. Oressa twisted to protect the man in her hands, taking the brunt of the blast on her shoulder. She stumbled, her massive knee slamming into the sand with a tremor that shook the ground. Her grip loosened. Harlan fell. He hit the sand hard, rolling to a stop near a jagged outcrop of black rock. He tried to stand, but his right leg buckled instantly. He looked down. A piece of jagged, twisted metal the size of his forearm was embedded deep in his thigh. Blood thick and dark soaked his canvas pants. The pain was a white-hot spike driving into his brain. He collapsed back into the red dirt, gasping for air. The gunships circled like vultures, banking hard for another strafing run. Their targeting lasers painted the ground in a deadly crosshatch. Harlan looked up at Oressa. She was bleeding from a deep gash on her shoulder, violet blood glowing faintly in the moonlight. She was a massive target. As long as she stayed in the open, they would tear her to pieces. "Go!" Harlan screamed. His voice was raw, tearing at his throat. He pointed his shaking finger toward the deep canyons to the east. "The terrain is too tight for the ship's run." Oressa looked down at him. She looked at the blood pooling beneath his leg. "Leave me!" Harlan roared, gripping a rock to pull himself upright, his face pale and slick with sweat. "You owe me nothing, Run. Damn you!" The gunships leveled their heavy cannons. The whine of the charging coils filled the air. Oressa didn't run. She turned her back to the canyons. She stood to her full, terrifying height, planting her massive feet firmly in the crimson sand. She looked up at the corporate machines, her white eyes burning with the fury of a dead civilization. Then she dropped to one knee. She reached down, her massive hands scooping into the sand, lifting Harlan effortlessly into the air. She brought him up to her chest, shielding him completely from the descending gunships. Harlan stared at her, breathing heavily, the pain in his leg throbbing in time with her massive heartbeat. "What are you doing? They'll kill you." Oressa looked down at him. The harsh metallic sounds of the battlefield seemed to fade away. She had pulled the words from his memories when their skin first touched. It was a sound like shifting tectonic plates, deep, resonant, and heavy with emotion. The words were English, broken and accented, but perfectly clear. "I see you, Harlan," she said, her breath washing over him like a warm wind. The cannons fired. Oressa closed her eyes, wrapping her arms tightly around him, bracing for the impact. "No one," she whispered, the rumble of her chest vibrating through his entire body. "No one gets left behind." The heavy kinetic rounds did not hit flesh. They hit a wall of solid violet light. When Oressa closed her eyes and wrapped her massive arms around Harlan, she did not just brace for impact. She pulled from the deepest, oldest reserves of her bloodline. The bioelectric hum that had calmed his trembling hand hours ago now erupted into a violent, blinding storm. The energy flared out from her skin, a dome of crackling plasma that smelled of burning ozone and raw power. The corporate artillery shells slammed into the shield. The kinetic force shattered the projectiles into a million pieces of harmless, molten slag. But the shield did not just stop the bullets. It grounded itself into the crimson wastes. The psychoactive red sand charged by the sheer magnitude of a matriarch's wrath reacted. A localized electromagnetic pulse ripped outward through the dust. It hit the three corporate gunships instantly. Their engines whined, choked, and died. Their searchlights shattered. Three multi-million-dollar war machines dropped out of the sky like dead birds, crashing heavily into the dunes, miles away, leaving nothing but plumes of black smoke against the twin moons. The silence returned heavy and ringing. Oressa opened her eyes. The violet shield dissipated, leaving the air tasting of copper. She looked down at her hands. She was trembling now. The effort had cost her. The glowing runes on her skin flickered, dimming to a faint, exhausted pulse. She opened her hands. Harlan lay in her palm. His face was pale, slick with cold sweat. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He gripped his thigh just above the jagged piece of shrapnel, his scarred hands stained deep red. The blood was flowing too fast. "We have to keep moving." Harlan rasped. His eyes fought to stay open. "Vane will send crawlers. They won't stop." Oressa did not argue. She knew he was right. She carefully adjusted him, pressing him gently against the center of her chest, right over her heart. She wrapped her thick fingers over his back to keep the cold desert wind off his shaking frame. "I have you," she murmured. She stood. Her left knee buckled slightly from the shrapnel wound she had taken earlier, but she forced the pain down. She locked her joint. She began to walk. The journey across the crimson wastes was a blur of agony and endurance. For Harlan, time lost its meaning. He drifted in and out of consciousness, anchored only by the massive, steady heartbeat drumming against his ear. The heat of her skin kept him from going into severe shock, but the blood loss was making the world spin. He didn't know how many hours passed. He only knew the rhythmic, heavy thud of her footsteps in the sand. Every step she took was a defiance against the universe that wanted them dead. When Harlan finally opened his eyes again, the sky was turning the color of bruised iron. Dawn was breaking. "We are here," Oressa's voice vibrated through to his ribs. Harlan weakly turned his head. Through the gaps in her massive fingers, he saw it. The Outland Boneyard. It was a graveyard for forgotten ships. Massive freighters, decommissioned frigates, and rusted mining barges lay half-buried in the red sand. It was a place where scavengers came to pick the bones of the corporate fleet. It was also the only place on Nexus 9 with ships large enough to hold a Titan. Oressa moved through the metal canyons of the boneyard. She was exhausted. Her breathing was heavy, her towering shoulders slumping. There Harlan whispered, pointing a blood-stained finger. Looming in the shadows of a canyon wall was a colossal, rust-eaten monolith, the Iron Leviathan. It was an old deep-space livestock hauler originally built to transport genetically modified space whales across the outer rim. It was ancient, ugly, and covered in decades of dust. But its cargo bay was massive. Oressa approached the belly of the ship. The main loading ramp was lowered, resting heavily on the sand. The interior was pitch black. She knelt at the base of the ramp. Carefully, with infinite gentleness, she set Harlan down on the rusted metal grating. Harlan gritted his teeth as his boots touched the deck. His right leg was entirely useless. The pain was a blinding white fire. He leaned heavily against the cold iron wall of the ship, dragging his injured leg behind him. The control room, he breathed, pointing up a narrow flight of industrial stairs. "I have to bypass the ignition locks." Oressa looked at the stairs. They were built for humans. She could not fit. "I will hold the door," she said softly. Harlan looked back out toward the desert. A cloud of red dust was rising on the horizon. Vane's ground forces. They had tracked the blood. They had tracked the energy surge. They were coming. Harlan didn't say goodbye. He just grabbed the handrail. He pulled himself up the stairs. It was the hardest climb of his life. Every movement tore at the shrapnel in his thigh. He left a smear of blood on the iron grate with every step. He didn't think about the pain. He thought about the 3 seconds he had frozen 10 years ago. He thought about his brother. He was not going to freeze today. He was not going to let someone else die because he was weak. He reached the top of the stairs and collapsed into the control room. It smelled of rat droppings and stale air. The consoles were dead. Thick dust covered the heavy analog switches. He dragged himself into the pilot's chair. He reached into his belt with trembling, bloody fingers and pulled out his splicing kit. He ripped the panel off the main console. A rat's nest of dead wires spilled out. Outside, the roar of heavy engines echoed through the boneyard. Vane's armored crawlers tore into the clearing. 6 heavy assault vehicles bristling with pulse turrets. They fanned out, surrounding the base of the Iron Leviathan. Warden Vane stood in the command hatch of the lead vehicle. He looked at the massive Violet Titan standing alone at the base of the boarding ramp. "End of the line, specimen," Vane's voice crackled through a megaphone. "You have nowhere left to run. Stand down and I might let the welder live in a cell." Oressa did not look at Vane. She looked at the armored vehicles. She looked at the weapons. She was tired. She was bleeding. But she was a matriarch. She planted her feet on the rusted ramp. She reached out and grabbed the industrial hydraulic pistons that controlled the bay doors. Up in the cockpit, Harlan's hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from blood loss. The wires were blurring together. Red to green, blue to ground. He needed the main reactor to spark, but the ignition coil was dead. He looked at his plasma torch. He looked at the heavy ignition manifold. He didn't have time to wire it. He had to jump it. He turned the torch on. The blue flame hissed. Down on the ground, Vane lost his patience. "Fire on her legs, bring her down." The turret spun. Oressa roared. It was a sound that shook the rust off the hull of the ship. She ripped the hydraulic pistons out of the ship's frame with her bare hands. Using them like massive steel clubs, she swung. She smashed the first crawler into scrap metal before it could fire a shot. The impact flipped the 20-ton vehicle end over end. The other crawlers opened fire. Pulse rounds tore into her arms and legs. She staggered, crying out in pain, but she did not fall. She swung again, crushing the turret of a second vehicle. She was buying seconds, buying time with her own flesh. In the cockpit, Harlan jammed the plasma torch directly into the ignition manifold. The heat fused the broken connections. A raw surge of electricity shot through the console, throwing Harlan back against the bulkhead. The shock should have stopped his human heart, but the residual bioelectric current Oressa had passed to him days ago flared in his nervous system, absorbing the lethal voltage and keeping him conscious. Deep in the belly of the ship, the ancient fusion reactor caught the spark. Deep in the belly of the ship, the ancient fusion reactor caught the spark. The Iron Leviathan groaned. It sounded like a dead god waking up. The deck plates vibrated. The heavy thrusters choked, spat black smoke, and then roared to life with a deafening, earth-shattering boom. Oressa dropped the steel pistons. She looked up. The ship was alive. She turned and sprinted up the colossal loading ramp, her heavy footsteps ringing like anvil strikes. Vane screamed at his gunners, "Shoot the engines! Bring it down!" But the Leviathan was already lifting. The sheer downward force of the main thrusters created a localized hurricane of red sand and superheated exhaust. Vane's crawlers were pushed back, their windshields shattering from the heat and pressure. In the cockpit, Harlan dragged himself back into the pilot's chair. His vision was going dark at the edges. He slammed his bloody fist into the massive throttle lever. The ship shot into the sky. The G-force crushed Harlan into the seat. He fought to keep his hand on the yoke. The sky outside the viewport shifted from bruised iron to deep purple to the cold, absolute black of space. They broke orbit. The structural alarms were screaming. The hull pressure was dropping. But the navigation computer showed clear space ahead. The corporate blockade was on the other side of the planet. They had slipped through the back door. Harlan engaged the autopilot, setting a course for the deepest, darkest sector of the outer rim. He pulled his hand off the throttle. He looked down at his blood-soaked leg. He didn't have the strength to bandage it. He closed his eyes. The darkness rushed in. He welcomed it. He had done it. He had paid his debt. When he woke, there was no pain. There was only a deep, vibrating warmth. Harlan opened his eyes. He was no longer in the cockpit. He was lying on a makeshift bed of heavy canvas tarps in the corner of the massive cargo hold. The lights were dim. He looked down at his leg. The canvas pants had been carefully cut away. The jagged shrapnel was gone. The wound was sealed shut, closed with a crude but effective weld of medical foam and cauterization. He looked up. Oressa was sitting on the iron floor next to him. She was battered. Her violet skin was marred by dark, angry burns from the pulse rifles. But she was alive. She was looking down at him, her white eyes soft and glowing in the dark hold. "You saved my life," Harlan whispered. His throat was dry. "You saved mine first," she replied. Her voice was low, a gentle rumble that settled his racing heart. Harlan slowly sat up. He winced as his thigh throbbed, but the bleeding had stopped. He looked around the massive, empty cargo hold of the ship. "Where are we drifting?" she said. "Outside their borders. The navigation system says we are safe. For now." Harlan rubbed his face with his calloused hands. Safe. It was a word he hadn't used in a decade. He looked at her. Her sheer size still commanded absolute awe, but he no longer saw a titan. He just saw Oressa. "We can't go back," Harlan said. His voice was heavy with the reality of their situation. "Earth won't take us. The corporations own the core worlds. We're ghosts now, outlaws, hunted by every bounty runner from here to the Orion Spur." Oressa didn't look afraid. She slowly shifted her weight, leaning closer to him. "We do not need their worlds," she said softly. She reached out with her massive right hand. She didn't touch him. Instead, she brought her hand to her own stomach. Harlan watched her. He noticed it then. The glowing, intricate runes along her arms and ribs had changed. The bioelectric light was no longer pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm. It was moving. The light flowed down from her chest, gathering and intensifying over her lower abdomen. It glowed with a warm, brilliant gold, a color he had never seen on her before. He stared at the light. He looked up at her eyes. Oressa smiled. It was a small, quiet smile filled with impossible wonder. "In the silence of the vault, you gave me your warmth," she whispered. "You shared your pain, our energies. They did not just heal, they connected." Harlan's breath hitched. He looked back at the golden light pulsing beneath her violet skin. He was a man of steel and plasma. He understood mechanics. He understood biology. What she was implying was scientifically, fundamentally impossible. A child, Harlan's voice broke. He sounded like a young man stripped of his cynical armor. "How life," she murmured, resting her hand over the golden glow, "finds a way in the dark, especially when it is guided by a heart that refuses to freeze." Harlan sat in silence. The hum of the ship's engines faded into the background. He thought about the brother he had lost to the cold vacuum of space. He thought about the years he had spent punishing himself, believing he was nothing more than a harbinger of death. And now here in the belly of a rusted, stolen ship, light years from anything resembling home, he had helped create life. He reached out his scarred, trembling hand. He placed it gently against the surface of her massive abdomen, right over the golden light. He felt it. It was faint, barely a whisper against his palm. But it was there. A tiny, rapid heartbeat. A secondary pulse hiding beneath the thunder of her own. Harlan bowed his head. He didn't cry. Men like Harlan didn't have tears left to shed. But his shoulders shook, and a sound of pure, overwhelming relief escaped his chest. Oressa gently rested her index finger on the back of his neck, her warmth grounding him as they drifted through the sea of stars. There was no grand welcome. There was no parade. The universe did not suddenly bend to accommodate them. The reality of survival was harsh, unforgiving, and relentless. 6 months later, the Iron Leviathan found its final resting place. They crashed a hard, calculated impact onto the surface of a nameless, uncharted moon in the deep frontier. The moon had a thin atmosphere, breathable but sharp with the smell of sulfur and iron. It was a barren rock of gray stone and howling winds. It offered nothing but isolation, which meant it was perfect. The massive ship's engines died for the final time. The Leviathan would never fly again. It was no longer a vehicle. It was a foundation. The years that followed were not built on fairy tales. They were built on sweat grease and iron. Harlan's leg never healed properly. The nerve damage from the shrapnel was permanent. He walked with a heavy, pronounced limp, relying on a cane he had forged from a piece of titanium landing gear. But his hands never shook again. Every day he strapped on his heavy canvas rig. Every day he fired up his plasma torch. He cut into the hull of the dead ship. He repurposed the life support scrubbers to filter the moon's harsh air. He tore out the interior bulkheads and welded them into a massive cavernous living space, wide enough and tall enough for a matriarch to stand comfortably. He built a geothermal tap into the moon's crust to provide heat. He didn't build a house, he built a sanctuary. Oressa worked beside him. Despite her pregnancy, her strength was unimaginable. She lifted the steel beams that would have required heavy machinery. She held the massive armor plates steady while Harlan welded them into place. They moved in perfect silent synchronization, a dance of a crippled human and an alien god carving a life out of dead rock. They didn't have much. They ate synthesized protein rations. They drank filtered condensation. Their clothes were patched canvas and woven thermal blankets. But at night, when the bitter winds of the moon howled outside their iron walls, they sat together by the glow of the geothermal furnace. Harlan would clean his tools, his bad legs stretched out straight. Oressa would sit beside him, her massive hand resting gently on his shoulder, the golden glow of her abdomen casting long, warm shadows across the room. They had nothing, and they had everything. 10 years later, the wind howled across the gray, rocky plains of the frontier moon. It whipped up clouds of sharp grit that scoured the rusted exterior of the settlement. It was no longer just a crashed ship, it was a home. Heavy armor plating patched the holes in the Leviathan's hull. A sturdy, reinforced porch had been welded to the side of the massive cargo bay covered by an awning of repurposed solar sails. Harlan stood on the porch. He looked older. The gray in his beard had turned to pure, stark white. The deep lines on his face were carved by a decade of harsh winds and hard labor. He leaned heavily on his titanium cane, his right leg stiff and unyielding. He wore his old canvas jacket, patched a dozen times over but clean. He narrowed his eyes, looking out through the blowing dust toward the edge of their property line. An old sputtering hover tractor was dragging itself across the rocks. It belonged to a scavenger family who had crash-landed 2 valleys over a few years ago. The frontier was slowly filling up with people like them. Outcast runners, the forgotten ghosts of the galaxy. Harlan and Oressa didn't invite them in, but they didn't chase them away. They lived by a simple rule: if you don't bring a gun, you don't get a grave. The tractor shuddered, ground its gears, and died in a plume of thick black smoke 100 yards from the porch. The driver, a ragged human in a pressure suit, kicked the side of the machine in frustration. Harlan didn't move. He just watched. The heavy blast doors of the cargo bay hissed open behind him. The ground vibrated slightly. Oressa stepped out onto the porch. She was as majestic as the day he met her. The years had not aged her. They had only deepened the calm authority in her white eyes. She looked down at Harlan, a fond smile playing on her lips. "Company," she asked, her voice a low musical rumble. "Just old man Miller breaking his axle again." Harlan grunted, shifting his weight on his cane. "Told him 3 weeks ago the primary strut was cracked. Didn't listen." Oressa chuckled. It was a sound that still made the iron plates of the porch vibrate. She rested her immense palm gently on the roof of the awning above Harlan's head. Before Harlan could grab his tool belt, a blur of motion shot past him. A figure darted out from the dark interior of the ship, vaulting effortlessly over the porch railing and landing lightly on the rocky ground below. It was a girl. She looked about 10 years old, but she was already 6 feet tall. Her skin was a beautiful muted shade of violet, much lighter than her mother's, blending perfectly with the gray and purple hues of the moon's dusk. She wore heavy canvas overalls smeared with black grease and a pair of oversized steel-toed boots. Her hair was a wild mane of dark curls. Her eyes were not solid white. They had irises. They were a piercing, bright silver. Elara Harlan barked, his voice gruff but lacking any real bite. "You didn't finish calibrating the moisture evaporators." "I'll do it later," Padre Lara yelled over her shoulder, already jogging toward the broken tractor. "Mr. Miller looks like he's going to cry." Harlan leaned on his cane and shook his head. He watched his daughter approach the frustrated scavenger. He watched as Miller nervously took a step back. People were always afraid at first, but Elara didn't loom over him. She smiled a bright, wide, human smile. She knelt down next to the smoking axle. She didn't ask for tools. She didn't ask for a welding torch. Elara reached out with her bare, violet hands. She grabbed the 2 cracked pieces of the heavy steel strut. She closed her eyes. A bright, crackling arc of blue bioelectricity jumped from her fingertips. The power of the matriarch bloodline channeled with the precision of a master welder. The metal glowed red, then white hot. She pushed the pieces together. The steel fused seamlessly, a perfect, unbreakable weld. She wiped her hands on her overalls, slapped the side of the tractor, and gave Miller a thumbs up. The scavenger stared in shock, then bowed his head in profound, stuttering gratitude. Harlan watched the exchange from the porch. The harsh wind pulled at his white hair. He looked down at his own scarred, aging hands. They were steady. They had been steady for 10 years. He didn't save the galaxy. He didn't tear down the corrupt corporations. He didn't win a medal. He was just a tired old man with a bad leg living on a rock in the middle of nowhere. But as he watched his daughter wave to the scavenger and run back toward the house, her silver eyes bright with the simple joy of helping someone in the dark, Harlan knew the truth. He had not let the vacuum win. He had not frozen. When the universe presented him with a monster in the dark, he had chosen to see a soul. He had chosen to reach out. He had chosen kindness when cruelty was the law of the land. And that choice had built a world. Oressa crouched down, bringing her face level with the porch. She looked at Harlan, seeing the quiet peace settling over his weathered features. "You did well, Welder," she murmured, the warmth of her breath washing over him. Harlan reached out, resting his calloused hand against her violet cheek. He looked at the home they built. He looked at the daughter running up the path. "Yeah," he rasped, a genuine, rare smile breaking through the scars on his face. "Not a bad day's work."